After we sold our first shipment of premium blueberries, we were able to sell them in China at prices that reflected the unbelievable quality, despite the fact we were in transit for 45 plus days. That's when I realized, okay, we have 8 billion people in the world. We are producing one of the healthiest snacks you could possibly eat that is enjoyable, is convenient. And it was seeing the results of how when they opened the container in China, the excitement, they were taking photos of our blueberries as if it was like a rock star coming to town. That would be the first aha moment for sure.
Hey folks, I'm Conor Gaughan, and welcome to Consensus in Conversation, a podcast where we're talking to the innovators, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders who are committed to building successful businesses that also help us build a better world. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a restful Veterans Day weekend. As we talked about on the last episode, in my conversation with Brandon Welch of Mad Capital, one of my key interests on this podcast and around the subject of sustainable future in general is agriculture. I'm fascinated by the new technologies and approaches to how we grow our food, but there's a lot more to it than just my personal interest. Not only does agriculture have a huge and obvious effect on sustainability, it's an industry that literally involves altering the environment, but it's also a linchpin of the global economy. Agriculture and food-related industries accounted for $1.53 trillion of the US GDP in 2023. It's approximately 5.6% of the total. Zooming out, there are roughly 400,000 companies around the world that make up our overall food system, which by some estimates accounts for something in the range of 16 to 20% of global GDP. In other words, around 1/5 of all economic activity on Earth is tied in some way to agriculture, and that is no small potatoes, or potentially a whole lot of small potatoes. And yet, I think we rarely step back to consider the incredible technological and logistical underpinnings that make it possible for me to go into an American grocery store in mid-November and buy even a fruit that's native to the region but out of season, a container of blueberries, let's say, let alone something tropical like a banana. The ability to do that and not have them cost the same as a major appliance is a technological advancement more recent than powered flight, something we actually discussed earlier this year in the introduction to our conversation with Monarch Suri of Glacier Grid. It's a fact that makes agriculture in general, and fruit in particular, a great example of another concept we've talked about at some lengths this year, the idea of hidden economies. It's a term I borrowed from the awesome conversation I had with Jay Kapoor, general partner at VSC Ventures, who used it to describe exactly these kinds of physical legacy industries that play a huge role in our day-to-day lives, but which we rarely ever think about. We take it for granted that year-round, whenever we go into a grocery store, fresh fruit and vegetables will be there. But it takes a lot behind the scenes to make that possible. And that means that it's a field ripe for disruption by someone who can figure out a more efficient and sustainable way to grow. And make no mistake, as with all hidden economies, there are huge rewards for doing so. Berries alone are nearly a $27 billion annual market, with a compound annual growth rate estimate close to 4% through the end of the decade. So it really shouldn't have been all that surprising that the financial world would be interested in an innovator in the sector. But I still have to confess that when I saw a Bloomberg article back in August on a $100 million raise closing for a blueberry grower, my interest was seriously piqued. What kind of crazy innovation did these guys have under the hood that was getting big institutions to place big valuation bets on a scarcely 10-year-old fruit company? Well, as it turns out, they do have some very cool technology in play when it comes to developing, breeding, and growing super premium varietals of berries, especially blueberries. But the real secret to their success is right there in their name, Agrovision. It's the vision part that's key. Co-founder and executive chairman Steve Magami, who joins me today on Consensus in Conversation, began Agrovision not so much because of a revolution in how to grow, but because he was able to see a perfect and unique opportunity for where to grow, Peru. And that's the part that made me want to dive in deeper with Steve on his story. Because as you'll hear, not only is it an excellent lesson for all of us in identifying and seizing business opportunities that others are missing, but it's also an awesome case study in how to achieve success, harnessing those opportunities in developing countries while creating meaningful, positive impact for local communities. With a vast amount of the world's agriculture taking place in the global south and other developing countries, often the same areas most heavily impacted by the effects of climate change, Agrovision offers an inspiring model in developing a sustainable win-win for everyone. Steve graduated from the University of California, Santa Barbara, with a degree in biology before beginning his career in private equity at Lovell Minnick, where he developed a keen eye for biotech investments and honed the special cross-section of knowledge that would allow him to recognize the confluence of factors in Peru that set the stage for the creation of Agrovision. It was so much fun having Steve on the podcast and digging in on what we can learn from his approach. So without further ado, let's dive into the conversation. So excited to have you on, Steve. Thanks for taking some time to catch up with us.
Conor, pleasure. Great to be with you.
Let's just jump right in. And I want to start way before Agrovision and just hear a little bit about you. So tell us where you're from originally and where you grew up.
Sure. I grew up in sunny Southern California in Orange County, went to school at UC Santa Barbara, so stayed pretty close to home. And I think the common theme for me was staying close to the ocean where I could get out in the water occasionally and surf, getting on the tennis court, staying in the sun and staying healthy.
Southern California is so addictive. I spent 7 years there and not a day goes by I don't miss it and miss the ability to be outdoors and be near the water or a couple hours from Joshua Tree, et cetera. So you grew up kind of in the part of the state that is famous for the citrus groves. I know you've mentioned a little bit before that that's kind of in your roots. Did you ever foresee kind of a career in agriculture,
Produce?
Yeah, back then.
No, not at all. Not at all. My grandfather was a large owner of farmland in Iran before my parents came here before the revolution. And he loved farmland. He loved agriculture. I grew up in a software household, all about entrepreneurship, the future, supercomputing. And I went to school not feeling, frankly, smart enough to go into computer science or not really having the bug. I went to school and, majored in biological sciences, was pre-med. And that was really my way of kind of playing it safe until I figured out what I really wanted to do, quite frankly.
Yeah. I mean, when did you figure that out? How did you figure that out?
Yeah. So a fraternity brother came to me late in college, what would be considered very late in today's world, and flagged to me and said, look, have you thought about doing an internship in investment banking or venture capital? And this was in the late 90s,
right?
Kind of 97, 98. And I said, no, but I'll give it a try. And I did. And it was incredible. And I worked for a gentleman named Jeff Carmody at a firm called Sandhill Capital. I worked for another amazing lady named Susan Block and did internships for both of them and really got the bug from there. And I kind of felt like I got lucky to have been there at the right time. And Santa Barbara wasn't exactly a hub for VC, but there was just enough of these kind of like quasi-retired investment bankers that had gone to Santa Barbara. So felt fortunate.
And I mean, you said just a second ago, you did grow up in kind of a software and entrepreneurial household. I mean, venture capital is, a dotted line relationship, I think, to entrepreneurship, pretty closely related, right? Was it, when you saw, did you immediately click like, this is something I did know that I wanted to do, or you could see back to your past and connect those dots personally?
I think there was a connection I felt, whether I articulated it at that moment, not so sure about that.
Yeah.
But I think that I certainly felt drawn in. I certainly felt like, oh, this is absolutely now clear. I've been playing it safe, right? Getting ready to go to med school, apply for med school. And fortunately, I found what I really want to do. I want to build big businesses. I want to work with smart people and hopefully make an impact in the world.
Were there any early lessons in the internship years in capital markets and venture capital that, you think back on and go, that one lesson is one of the foundational ones that I think about every day, or that, as I'm building this business today, decades later, that I still hearken back to?
Well, I certainly saw at a very young age the boom and bust in internet. So the collapse in 2000, right, of the internet bubble that formed in the late 90s was very much front and center. And I felt it. I went into private equity. We were doing some VC venture capital at Putnam Lovell Capital Partners, which ended up turning into Lovell Minnick Partners. But the majority of what I was doing was growth investments in late stage established companies and buyouts. But just enough VC to kind of keep that connection with those early stage entrepreneurs. And I think that left an impact on me in a number of ways, right? I feel like a risk manager. What I do is manage risk about how we allocate both financial and human capital. And so having seen now multiple cycles, having been through now over the last quarter century, multiple cycles, it's certainly part of kind of my experience set, and it informs kind of how I think about things.
Yeah. I know across your career, you've covered sectors ranging from fintech to, stuff in the more biotech space. Did you have kind of passionate direction, or were you open to all deals? Like, how did you kind of migrate between sectors and settle into what you wanted to be focused on?
Well, so private equity is hard to get into. I felt fortunate just to break in, quite honestly. And I broke into a segment that's on the more, let's say, interesting, right? Financial services was an interesting place to be in from a private equity standpoint. You're dealing with really sophisticated CEOs and owners and founders. We were playing in asset management. We were playing in financial planning. We were playing in, areas around that. And so as I left there, I would say it was really a journey that started around what was interesting when I left to kind of start my journey of entrepreneurship when I left Lovell Minnick Partners, which was a difficult decision given how incredible the people there were and are. But I think it felt like the right time and I was there for 6 years. And the journey I started on pretty quickly was around tech and renewable energy. So I started to look at deals in and around those areas. And I think renewable energy certainly drew me in. It was another heyday. And then that pulled me into agriculture slowly, given the feedstock to biofuels, right?
Yep. I mean, just thinking about, what you just said, we've heard and talked with a lot of folks, including, investors, this theme, this belief that the next unicorns are all coming out of clean tech, climate tech, like that this is, if you're kind of in the investor side of the ledger, this is where you should be focused. I'm curious for your take on that, kind of having spent time there before becoming an operator, what you think of that kind of perspective these days.
Yeah. Well, I think that certainly you've really seen now a kind of a multi-decade churning of the marginal players going out, right? And really only the strongest players surviving, I feel like in clean tech and renewable energy, and really getting the costs of technology and infrastructure down. And I've been frankly a skeptic until now. I'm a tech optimist, but I think from a clean tech industry standpoint, I kind of view the world as like you have the plays that are exceptional, like those that are launched by Elon or backed by Elon, and the others that are exceptional out there. And then you have a really difficult industry. So, watching what Coastal is funding and watching what some of the VCs are funding and looking at what we can incorporate in our business, we're certainly obviously looking to deploy what we can from a renewable energy and sustainability standpoint in terms of the latest tech around clean tech. So I think it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it can't not, right? There's so many smart people putting so much time, effort, and capital into these spaces. I just have to think that we're going to see a lot of excitement continuing for a generation here.
Absolutely. And by the way, I think what we're seeing with now the whole boom in AI and compute and data and how that ties into energy, I think we're going to see, that's certainly going to drive almost a super cycle, right?
Right.
Potentially in renewable energy and clean tech.
Yeah, it's all totally interrelated. So before we kind of get the Agrovision origin story, I feel like we got to start with the adventure that first led you to Peru. So give us a little bit of that before we get into Agrovision. Set us up with that story.
Sure. So, we're talking about the heyday here of renewable energy and the heyday of emerging market, kind of 2007, right? I've been asked as an investor, as a financier, looking to get behind deals from a private equity standpoint to come down to, I've been going to South America to see, what's going on in Brazil, the opportunities in Brazil, and traveling around Latin America, Mexico, and find myself in Peru after having been asked several times to come down. Finally, I go down. It was really to go look at a renewable energy opportunity. A couple of kind of first-time entrepreneurs, very charming, a number of people telling me that you got to meet these guys. And there's a blending mandate in the country, the government's behind it, right? Clean fuel. And so it pulls me down to Peru and I just sit down at a restaurant for lunch in Lima. And I felt like I was in the middle of a boom, some sort of boom. It felt like what you would expect to be in Silicon Valley in the middle of the boom. The energy was certainly, felt and obvious. And so I started to really look at what I thought was an underbanked market in Peru for just generally opportunities outside of mining, right? Mining felt fully baked. And I started to see some smart money come down. I wasn't just down there alone. And I saw the signals, right? But it was still going to be there were still a lot of myths about Peru, right? A lot of myths about the history of Peru that kept, I would say, a lot of players out. And so it really took smart money that had some kind of, strong connection to the opportunity to look past the myths and to see the incredible potential of this country.
Give us an example of some of the kind of, what was stopping other folks? Like what were examples of either the myths or just the barriers that you saw folks unable to kind of get past?
Yeah. So there was a myth around the history in terms of terrorism. You had a myth around the instability of the government that
Sure.
while there was always a lot of drama with politics, that didn't stop effectively what was a commodity super cycle at that point. But the larger point here was the country has incredible resource. The country is set up as an export-oriented country. The government needs the tax revenue. The government needs the foreign direct investment to drive its own educational, its own social programs, its own healthcare programs. And so effectively, no matter how much drama there would be in the government, in the end, you needed foreign direct investment and you needed export revenue to continue to fund those programs. So there was underlying kind of non-obvious alignment, complete alignment between me coming to the country, eventually then with my co-founder, Tom Snyder, and our two founding investors. And there was complete alignment over what we wanted to do from an export standpoint in terms of superfruits.
Yeah, so that, I mean, this is the perfect tee off, right? You're going down there, you see a climate. The metaphors here are just too much. I'll say a climate ripe for opportunity. You know, what planted the seed for Agrovision itself? What's the spark that lit the fuse of this idea?
Yeah, so Agrovision was really born out of a view that we could take what was, at the time we said arguably, but we no longer say arguably, what is the most stable, unique microclimate in the world on the northern coast of Peru, and what we could do with the right superfruits on an extended basis to kind of fill the northern hemisphere off season where there were, structural shortages because it was incapable of supplying itself during its own off season. And the southern hemisphere was the place to supply the northern hemisphere. And you have a very large market in the northern hemisphere between all the consumption, all the population, right, in the northern hemisphere. And Peru was the only game in town, and that was not obvious. And so seeing that the early days, it was clear. Others thought of this, I think, from the standpoint of like, okay, great agricultural production. What we really looked at was the size of the markets. What we were looking at was where do we develop a differentiated business that was going to have an enduring kind of level of differentiation. And that meant we were going to start building this with a view of stacking technology, starting with genetics. And then as we built up the value chain and we own and control the value chain all the way to the retailer, starting to deploy technology in every link of the chain through the organization, and ultimately building what was going to be a disruptive business in the superfood industry that we thought could be truly transformative in inspiring the consumers to snack healthier and draw them away from, other forms of snacking and even more commodity types of fruits. And so blueberries was the clear play that we bet on, and we bet on big and built the largest premium blueberry business in the world, starting with Peru as a foundation. And we've since expanded globally to now 8 countries that we're producing in.
So it sounds like, and please correct me if it's not the right approach, but this feels like the perfect case study in like a financial approach to building a business, right? Like you recognize that there was macro opportunities to invest and achieve returns. You said, okay, what does the entire landscape of opportunities look like? Which ones are we most interested in? Which ones could be effect? Which ones could be scale? How could we do that most efficiently? Versus like you sat down at lunch and had a berry and you're like, I need to sell these berries in America. This was like a really deliberate, like, hey, I'm a financier. I know how to make a business. I want to make a business. There's opportunity here. And then like funneling down to what the best product and path for that product to market looks like. Is that kind of how it started and evolved a little bit?
I think that's really spot on. We knew that if we started with a place that was really kind of a wonder in the world from the standpoint of what it could produce. And by the way, there was very limited water resources. So it was, I think, further more interesting because the barriers to entry to go into Peru were huge.
Right.
On the coast, not in the Amazon. Obviously, there's plenty of water in the Amazon, but on the coast, there's really a scarcity of water, of the right kind of water. And then there's a lot of complexity in land and title ownership, and then there's complexity in environmental. So it was difficult to find bankable assets or land and water assets. So we love the barrier, we love the advantages, and we love the off-season play. So we felt this is only a question of how big could the markets be for what we wanted to do, how big of an impact we make, and how do we use this as the proof of concept, as our first product? Because it won't end here.
Yeah.
We go down this road, we're going to build this platform. It's going to start with blueberries, but it's not going to end with blueberries.
Yeah.
Right?
So extending that same kind of mental model, the banker in me vividly remembers or has nightmares about perhaps that terrible section of every filing, risk factors. And, you guys you just articulated one or two like immediate ones, which you processed as barriers once you were in, which is, I think, a really interesting insight into how you think, right? But like there's clear risk factors, in the early days, right? There was infrastructure and water and title, land ownership, like how that process worked. I'm curious, kind of, as you look back and think about what got you guys over those humps, or what you've seen evolve to solve for some of those risks. Whether it was like, I've heard you discuss in the past, the almost irrigation project is one example.
Yeah.
Do you actually think there's any interesting ways of thinking about those kinds of problems and solutions that has application for developing economies in general? Like just stuff that like others should tease out or understand about developing economies based on what you experienced kind of watching some of those risks get mitigated in Peru?
Yes. We could do a whole podcast on that alone.
Fair.
Conor, that's huge. That is a really big topic. And by the way, I haven't gone into that publicly before, but what was done in the almost irrigation project where tunnels were drilled through two Andes mountains to bring water to the coast because this location was that special, we had never heard of happening in agriculture in the world before.
Yeah.
We couldn't find one single example of that happening in the world outside of Peru. And so, this took decades, but we saw that this is something that actually could be done inside of like 5 years, right? If you really had an organized, aligned series of constituencies. And so what this meant for us as we thought about, connecting and putting together a puzzle, a global footprint, was we spent a lot of time, I moved to Peru and lived there with my co-founder, Tom Snyder. We spent a lot of time in hydrology and hydrogeology, because even though we had that water coming from the runoff of a river that went into the Amazon, we also had to drill wells for contingency, and we had to really understand the aquifer. And so we spent a lot of time, in the geology, the hydrology, with some of the smartest specialists in the world. And so that then gives you a foundation for when you go into other extremely unique microclimates around the world. Okay, how do you model out and underwrite the water situation? And then as you think about underwriting it, what can you justify from an investment standpoint, from a CapEx standpoint, right? So give us a really strong foundation for thinking about this in a global way.
Yeah.
And by the way, what that leads to in terms of developing and uplifting the communities, transforming lives, empowering women who are half of the working population, really exciting kind of positive impact, right? Socially.
Yeah. That's actually, I was almost about to ask a question that was related to that, but even one other kind of, we'll call it in my model here, a little risk factor or challenge walking in, you and the founding team didn't really have personal connections back to Peru. You weren't native Spanish speakers. You weren't coming out of the ag industry for decades. Like, you weren't the natural business builders from like a expertise or cultural connection standpoint. So I'm curious how you guys navigated all that and what advice you'd give to folks who, want to jump into something, but maybe feel like they don't have all the natural connections to it. And so they stop. Like what could we learn from your jumping into the deep end a little bit and believing in the model, believing in the business case when you didn't necessarily have all the perhaps traditional prerequisites aligned beforehand?
So we like to say, as outsiders coming in, Tom and myself and our founding partners, Mark and Carrie, we like to say that disruption comes from outside. And I think we're not the only ones that say that. I think we like to say that like experience doesn't necessarily lead to disruption either, right? So our lack of experience, our lack of accepting the status quo, we didn't know too much. We were blessed to not know too much. So I would say, I actually think founders who don't come from within are generally probably more likely to be successful. It then becomes all about the grit. It becomes all about the assessment of the opportunity and how rigorous they are and how deep they go, right? And keeping themselves honest and having that risk management kind of component element of their thinking.
So if you connect that kind of outsider mentality to the point you actually just made immediately before about finding or bringing about positive, local impact, how does an outsider or outside money, how do you navigate the trust building process with local communities? How did you conceptualize the opportunities early on for, your project and capital to be part of a mutually beneficial growth story and not one that's exploitative?
Yeah. So we started the business with a mission of transforming lives while we were going to be transforming the land to precision irrigated production farmland, which is, if you looked at the aerial photos of before and after, you would have thought, how did you even think you could produce here? Because it was literally like sand dunes. I think so. So starting with that mission of transforming lives, we set out on a path of a strong sense of obligation, of commitment to the community. A founding member of our team, Eduardo Aza, the most important hat he wore was the sustainability and the community relations hat. And in fact, he's in Colombia today. He was at the COP16 UN conference on biodiversity yesterday. And so really committing to the community, committing to them in terms of doing the right thing here. This was taking kind of desert land that nothing had been done with it. And this was investing massively in transforming it with a huge amount of leap of faith that we were taking, that all of our thesis, all of our views were right to make that plunge. And so, after all these years, all the decades of nothing having been done, taking virgin land and transforming it, not ever farmed, right, was something that was enriching to the community, something that aligned us with the community completely. And so it was exciting to also bring work to the communities that were in and around this area that no longer had to drive hours and hours to find work or were unemployed.
Yeah.
And so this felt great. And then in protecting the environment, forestry reserve projects, we ended up winning awards. In fact, that's one of the things that Eduardo was in Colombia yesterday for. The Sembrando Futuro project became very well known in circles, and now at COP16, the importance of biodiversity and restoration processes in northern Peru, that is like all about that. So there was a deep kind of commitment from us as part of our mission here to the community.
As you you've got this model on paper that has potential. You're down there, living there, digging in, no pun intended, on the hydrology studies, and understanding it all. And you've got the investment dollars to start flowing. You're working on building, this transformative irrigation system. At what point did you stop and look around and say, okay, we got something, like this is going to work?
Yeah, it took a while. It was not fast by any means. So I would say it was after we sold our first shipment of premium blueberries. And by the way, we were able to sell them in China at prices that reflect the quality, that reflected the unbelievable quality, despite the fact, we were in transit for 45 plus days. That's when I realized, okay, we have 8 billion people in the world. We are producing one of the healthiest snacks you could possibly eat that is enjoyable, is convenient. And we're seeing an industry in commodity blueberries where people are tired of the inconsistency, where they're tired of what we call berry roulette, right? The crapshoot, right? Which people are tired of that in the produce section in general, which is what kind of our mission has been now extended to, is really transforming that experience across the produce aisle. And so it was that shipment, it was seeing the results of how when they opened the container in China, Conor, the excitement, they were taking photos of our blueberries as if it was like a rock star coming to town. And so that would be the first aha moment for sure.
That's awesome. So catch us up to now. Then what is the current elevator pitch for Agrovision, today?
So as we think about, we've obviously now, we're 12 years into this from when we started it. And we truly believe that we're on a path to inspiring kind of the world to snack healthier. And so we've kind of built this platform that is built for several things. It's been built to achieve our mission, right, of inspiring healthy snacking across the produce aisle, transforming that whole aisle. But it's from the kind of the 8 wonders of the world, using leading technology, starting with the genetics that we're commercializing that are very climate aligned and highly resilient. It's about tech that we're deploying across the own value chain, which is something that was unique to build a platform, a global platform that was built for 52 weeks, premium product focused on, the data needed and what we would do with the data to drive quality, to drive reliability, to drive eating experience, to drive efficiency in the operations. And ultimately what that meant was to drive trusted long-term durable retail partnerships, ultimately with our brand, the Fruitist. And so again, starting with blueberries as the proof of concept, we see this kind of market for this type of healthy snack that's so enjoyable is just exponentially larger than we think we can supply in any reasonable time frame. And we're excited that we're uniquely kind of positioned to go after this opportunity.
What do you guys, curious how you think about the total addressable market. Like, what is the size of the fruit industry or the superfruit industry, or however you guys define it? What do you guys look at as kind of the total market size from your perspective?
Yeah. So from our perspective, we're playing in between berries and cherries, more or less a $50 billion market. That there is a product that we're eyeing, expanding into that would probably take it to 100 billion. But within the 50, as we think about the market for us, while the share we're targeting, we have aspirations to target a very large share in the future, the more important thing for us is how we deliver that consistent experience that is not normal for produce. Because typically weather impacts produce, and typically companies, it's hard. We've invested over $550 million to date, built a global platform. Everything we've done is extremely hard. And so we're going to hopefully prove that we're going to deliver an unusually consistent premium eating experience to our consumers through this Fruitist brand that really embodies that level of quality, that level of shelf life, that level of eating experience in a consistent way. And it's going to also embody the innovation and the fun that we're having. So we're going to be coming out, we're going to be introducing new innovative pack styles for grab and go and for snacking. Ready to wash and convenience will be something you'll see probably from us in the future. And we've sponsored 2 teams now. We've sponsored the DC United professional soccer team in Washington, DC, and we've sponsored the Trojans now here in LA. And we're excited to be the official superfruit sponsor of both teams. And we're going to have a lot of fun with sports. It turns out that the alignment here between us, where we're going, and these teams and the world of sports is massive. And we're having some pretty exciting conversations with others now, both professional athletes and also teams around the world about what we can do together.
Give folks at home your actual definition of the term superfruit. It's thrown around a lot these days, but what does it mean to you?
Yeah. So from my standpoint, you're talking about superfruit, you're talking about nutrient dense, nutrient rich fruit that is going to be impactful in various ways to health, right? By the way, both mental health and regular health. And that's a big topic today. And our definition of superfruit, or the world we play in, is obviously the kind of superfruit that is so enjoyable that you're not eating it for the health. You're eating it because it's enjoyable, but it is also super nutrient rich. So that's what's so fun about what we're doing.
Love it. I've heard you speak in the past of your intention for Agrovision to be a generational company. And so I'm curious if you could kind of talk us through what that means to you and why that's important, from the outset, how you guys have been thinking about that from day one, how it's affected how you've scaled, or how you thought about building the business and the operations.
Sure. So this takes time. It's taken us now 12 years to get here on building this, but we're now at a point where we truly have a platform that's leverageable to really kind of roll out these other products in a significant way. But this will still take time. So the decisions we're making around the pipeline of products across the produce aisle, across scaling up across the 8 countries where we produce in, the partnerships with retailers, all the technology we're developing for the long term. We have technologies that are kind of more on the moonshot end of the spectrum, and we have technologies that are already running, we've developed, that are already contributing meaningfully to our operations and driving efficiency and driving enhancement of quality and shelf life, et cetera. And then we have, we see kind of endless opportunities in what is effectively a low innovation category, Conor. This is what we call a low innovation industry, to be quite direct about it. And so it's fun. We're playing an incredibly complex industry with a lot of smart people and players. However, we think we're coming at this with a different approach, and we think that there's just so much we could do.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. If you put, one of your first hats back on as a venture capitalist, right? I think about it from a banker's perspective. I'm curious what your raise process looked like, because I can imagine You say it's not necessarily the most innovative of industries. How did you approach the storytelling for the business to get investors excited when, investors are these days, especially they're looking for the sexy AI return to the sexy AI story. Like, what's the story that got the street or, equity folks interested in what can otherwise be perceived as a low innovation industry?
Yeah. Well, I think that our investors saw that what we were doing was using this massive platform that we've built with technology that we have been developing with partners and without partners, both to inspire healthy snacking in a way that has just tremendous upside and tremendous demand potential, exponential, really. And at the same time, doing this is so hard. The difficulty, the capital required, where this could be done from, the barriers to get into these production areas that are, as I said, I described the barriers to get into Peru. You have similar barriers to get into, call it 7 of the 8 of our wonders, what we call the wonders of the world.
Yeah.
So difficult. So I think that we've been blessed to have really smart investors that came on. And, if you look at what we've done, we've brought on some of the smartest businessmen and entrepreneurs in the world that were leaders in their industry. Whether it's Steve Kaplan, who co-founded Oak Tree Capital, Ben Nickel, who was a leader in his industry, whether it's now Element, who is a leader in ag tech and super, super fun to work with. And we've been actually collaborating for years before they came in the most recent round. So I think they saw that this mission we were on was one that was so sufficiently difficult, and we had such a great proof of concept and such a great level of traction and track record we were developing, that this was going to be truly a very, very large business in the future. And we were building it, making decisions for a 20, 30 year kind of outlook.
Right.
And, it's all about the people at the end of the day. And ultimately, they got excited about the team that Tom and I built. We have an incredible team, a deep leadership team, which is frankly pretty unusual in our industry, all of which who are owners, by the way, in the business. And our investors recognized that and knew that it was a matter of, how much we got done. It wasn't about kind of if, it was more about when, right? When we were going to achieve these things and if we could hit the targets that we set out, which are optimistic. And so at the same time, my background, it certainly lended itself towards talking with, understanding how investors view these opportunities, right? I was in the seat.
Yeah.
So from that standpoint, I certainly had an advantage in kind of raising the capital that we have raised and managing the business with a level of risk tolerance that investors were quite comfortable with.
Right.
And when I'm often asked, what are your pain points? One of my pain points is we have more opportunity than we can manage because we are so focused and we do not tolerate risk in a normal way.
Right.
So
let's pivot a little bit and talk about sustainability strategy. You mentioned your team's at COP this week. Obviously, agriculture as an industry is one that thrives off the land, and especially the folks that I know who have toiled in fields, they are acutely aware and thoughtful about their relationship with the land and with the climate. So I'm curious how you guys think about sustainability and your approach to kind of working in local communities to ensure you're operating sustainably, and how you guys just your approach in general.
So, sustainability has been in our DNA from the beginning, as I mentioned. We're aligned with 11 of the 17 UN SDGs. And, as we think about some of the proof points, we were first to get the EFI Equitable Food Initiative certification in our industry for South America. Literally, we are passing on price to our workforce who are doing the hard work of picking with excellence, the level of quality with that consistency that consumers are overjoyed and delighted and excited about. We have the most difficult to attain certifications across the board. That is one that's really a standout example. Worker welfare is super important to us. Food safety is super important to us. Mitigating climate change is important to us. We do have our own aspirations on net zero. I've talked a lot about improving the quality of the lives of local population and communities. I could only really scratch the surface in the time permitted. So, I think from the standpoint of sustainability, there's so much to talk about, but at the end of the day, it's about the people, it's about the planet. We want to make this a kind of a win-win-win-win-win. There's so many ways we can win across the board here.
Yeah, I've really been impressed with some of the social programs I've seen you guys implement. I'm curious if there's any others that you wanted to highlight. I know there's the Sowing Hope medical program, there's roads education. Like it's just give us kind of a couple other highlights because we as an organization, I think it's important. We think it's important to kind of highlight all this work because it really demonstrates the power of the private sector to do well for all constituents. So curious if you just give us a couple of your top initiatives that you're excited about.
Yeah, sure. So I would say that the youth is something that I'm just really passionate about through all of what we're doing. And so impacting the youth in the communities through recreational programs, through the enrichment of the communities and where we see that going, providing support for schools or basic needs of the communities that flow through to families and in particular the youth, empowering women, half our labor force being women in communities. When the woman comes home with that paycheck, a formal paycheck, not an informal one, you see a formal paycheck is the way that empowers the woman in the household who plays such an important role for the children it's incredible. And, we wouldn't be here if I didn't have the support of my wife to do what she's been doing in terms of the household with our two children. And so to see and feel that same empowerment in these communities where the women historically haven't been empowered has been one of the most exciting things for sure.
Yeah. I'm curious how you might make the business case to other companies to be thoughtful about some of these, constituency engagement programs, stakeholder engagement programs. How would you reflect this in a business case for peers of kind of having a thoughtful community engagement strategy that is meaningful to the lives of local folks where you're operating?
Sure. So I think I would start by saying, what is your target on the number of people you're impacting in the communities? How many are you impacting directly? How many are you impacting indirectly? What are the greatest needs for the community? How are you impacting their needs? How are you setting up kind of short-term and long-term KPIs? What is the feedback when you go out and poll the community, right? If you're not getting a 9 out of 10, you're probably not doing what you thought you're doing in terms of the impact you're making. And so I would start with those basics. And right there alone, there is just so much you could do if you can just execute on that foundation.
Yeah. Let me ask, we got one more big question. Not all the headlines coming out of COP this week leave me optimistic. I think every time there's, an event like this, we get headlines about kind of where is a globe we're faltering. And I'm just thinking back to, you talking about what I, jokingly referred to as the risk factors. You didn't look at them as risk factors. You looked at them as we should go into this market because that's a barrier to entry once we get in. I think, you clearly have this view of the world, which is probably default optimistic or default positive. And so I'm curious, like when I talk to folks who do kind of get these headlines about the negativity or the challenges facing us on sustainability or in climate, their default is to shut down and think we just can't make a difference, so why try? And I hear in your voice and in your story the opposite, like a natural inclination towards finding the reason to hope, to motivate, to move forward. I'm curious how you would inspire folks to, the phrase I tend to use is defeat defeatism. How can we learn from your default perspective and seek the optimistic path and make the effort to change things for the better?
Okay, so this will come out soon in more detail, but we've been invited into the World Economic Forum as an innovator, right? And not just a unicorn, but as an innovator. And we're taking a leadership role in global matters on food and nutrition and climate. And I would say that the most successful companies are in a position to make the greatest impact. So we, I think, have a responsibility to lead and put our money where our mouth is and walk the walk. So your point about me being optimistic is it's super interesting kind of study in itself. I think about alignment. I think that alignment is not insurmountable in these difficult situations. The question is, how do we create the alignment where everyone is rowing in the same direction? We can make the impact and unlock the potential. And so I do think it's about how we come together. And yeah, we're super optimistic in some of these difficult areas, and we're going to put some time into this, in terms of what we think is possible from a climate standpoint, carbon footprint standpoint, from a water sustainability standpoint. And we've just got the smartest people with capital that are in a position to make a difference need to kind of lead by example would be my short answer.
Yeah. All right. So we'll end with an easy one. Tell folks where they can find out more, under what labels they can grab your products in stores around the country. How can we point folks to some of the best tasting berries that you guys have on your roster?
So look for the Fruitist brand. We have a Fruitist Jumbo blueberry with jumbo and giant letters, but look for the Fruitist brand of berries across Costco, Trader Joe's, Whole Foods, Sprouts, Publix, Albertsons, and many other stores in the US, North America, Tesco, Marks and Spencer's in the UK, across the Middle East, in Costco and Sam's in China. So look out for the Fruitist. We hope that you'll be happy and write to us. Let us know your feedback. We want to hear it because we're here to really, truly excite you to snack healthier and more nutritiously.
We'll make sure all that is in the show notes. Thank you so much for taking the time today. It was a lot of fun.
Conor, it's been a pleasure. Likewise.
A huge thanks to Steve for joining me on today's Consensus in Conversation. You can learn more about Agrovision and find out where their products are available near you by visiting agrovision.com. And we'll have that link and more info on how to connect with them on socials in the show notes. As for us, you can reach us by email at cic@consensus-digital.com. That's cic@consensus-digital.com. Or you can connect with me directly on LinkedIn and Threads at ckgaughan. That's at ckgaughan. We'd love for you to reach out with any questions, comments, or ideas sparked by today's chats. Or if you have a great suggestion for a future guest. Please give us a follow, a like, or leave a review wherever you're listening if you enjoy the show. It really helps us grow our reach and keep bringing you more conversations with the business leaders you want to hear from. Thanks, everyone. We'll be back next week with a brand new conversation. Consensus in Conversation is hosted by me, Conor Gaughan, and executive produced by me and Jeff Rock. Our producer is Will Gatchell, with editing by the team at Reasonable Volume. Special thanks to the Consensus team, including creative director Kate Tucker and Greg Harrigal on research. Consensus in Conversation is a podcast by Consensus Digital Media, produced in association with Reasonable Volume.